The Mishnah says, "Matchil b'gnudim misayim b'shvach," start in shame or disgrace and finish in praise. The word praise actually only comes a couple of times in the Haggadah. And we're going to see it at the end of our paragraph of Avadim Hayinu. Avadim Hayinu is the beginning point. That's presumably the Genut. That's what we saw in the Talmud. That Shmuel, or in the earlier text, Rabbah says the Genut is we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And then, but the Talmud doesn't really identify what the shvach is. What is the praise? So we're going to get onto the other side of this journey by looking at the end of the paragraph of Avadim Hayinu. Even afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu banim, kulanu zekenim, kulanu yodim et Torah. Even if all of us were sages, were wise, were elders, knew the Torah, mitzvah len l'saper b'yitziat Mitzrayim. It is a commandment upon us to tell the story of going out of Egypt. Whoever increases or spends extra time telling the story of Yitziat Mitzrayim, of going out of Egypt, they are mishubach, they are praiseworthy. That is to say, here the Haggadah is sort of identifying for us the shvach, the praise, the end point. So if the starting point was we were slaves in Egypt, then the end point isn't necessarily it's not that we went out of Egypt. I mean, that is a point along the journey, but the end of the paragraph might lead us to the actual telling of the story. That is the praise. That is the ultimate sort of end point on the journey. We've arrived at a place in which we are praiseworthy, because it's the opposite of being enslaved, is that we can sit for a long time and tell a story. And as I'm sort of arguing, you can tell the story in multiple ways, and that itself is an expression of freedom. Okay, that's the end of the Avadim Hayinu paragraph, and as I'm saying, it itself is sort of defining the boundaries of Genut, Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves, and Shvach, telling the story is Mishubach, is praiseworthy. Let's take a look at the next paragraph in the Haggadah, the story of the 5 elders. Maaseh Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon. They were reclining in Benei Berak and were telling the story by you misaprim. Here's the L'saper b'yitziat Mitzrayim. This is an example of what the previous paragraph was speaking about. They were misaprim b'yitziat Mitzrayim. Kol oto alayla. It took them all night, and they were telling the story of going out of Egypt until their students came and said to them, "Our rabbis, the time for Kriyat Shema of the morning has come." So they were going all the way until the dawn. And this is, again, just sort of, it seems to be illustrative of the previous paragraph of what is the praiseworthy point that we have arrived at. It's the ability to tell the story and tell it over and over and turn it over and over until you're saying it all night long. Now, I'm trying to understand sort of what is the significance of these 5 rabbis. This is, scholars point out that this text does not appear anywhere else besides for the Haggadah. And therefore, and not only that, it's only in the Babylonian tradition of the Haggadah. It's not even in the Eretz Yisrael version of the Haggadah. And so there's a question about sort of how old and how authentic the story is. But I'm sort of more interested less in the historical aspect than in the narrative history of this story. Like, what is it trying to tell us? Once we have a story, we can start to say, what is the story trying to tell us? And I want to argue that the 5 characters here, the 5 rabbis, are not incidental, but that they are themselves a part of what the story is trying to communicate. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's more than just some rabbis were sitting, and telling the story of Pesach all night. But what is it about these specific rabbis that can help us draw a sort of further narrative conclusion? Or to put it another way, who's in the room and who's not in the room? That's part of what I want to explore. So we have Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. They're from the sort of first generation of Tanaim, of the rabbis of the Mishnah. They themselves have a number of conflicts with each other, but here seem to be all together in one group. And then you have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon, who are sort of in the next generation, and maybe they're listed in rank order. Somebody has suggested that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in the middle might suggest that he is the most important. And indeed, there is a moment in the history of the Beit Midrash, at least the narrative history of the Beit Midrash, where Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is the leader. He is the Nasi. He is the one who's sort of running the show for the Beit Midrash. And so perhaps it might make sense that he's in the middle there. We are going to hear more from Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in the next paragraph of Haggadah, which we're going to look at tomorrow. But notice who's missing. The other sort of main character that you might expect in a group like this, who is Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is the foil to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He's the one who is deposed from the Beit Midrash. He's the one who limited access in the Beit Midrash in the story in Brachot, chapter 4, Brachot in the Talmud. And so it's perhaps striking that he's not there. Even more so, the fact that we have it seems like an earlier version of the same kind of story that does show up in the Tosefta, that doesn't appear in the Haggadah, but shows up in one of the earliest texts of Jewish law. And that's what I wanted to sort of compare it to. So let's take a look at that on the bottom of the page. We read this law that a person is required to engage not in the Sipur of Yetziat Mitzrayim, not in the telling of the going out of Egypt, but rather Behilchot Pesach, in the laws of Pesach, or the laws of the Pesach sacrifice, all night long. And then we have a story, just like the story above, Maaseh, but here we have different characters. Maaseh b'Rabban Gamliel uzikenim shayu misubin bebeit baitos ben zunin belod. Vayu asukin behilchot Pesach kol halayla ad krot hagever. What happened? It happened that Rabban Gamliel and the elders, the unnamed elders, were reclining in the house of Baitos ben Zunin, reclining probably, the sort of synonym for eating a banquet meal like the Seder. And they were engaging in the laws of Pesach all night until the cock crowed. They removed the tables in front of them, and they got up and went to the Beit Midrash. So this was their flow. They were all night long, and that's similar to our story. But the starting point is learning the laws of Pesach, and the end point is going to the Beit Midrash to study more. Whereas in our story, the starting point is the telling of the story of Pesach, and the end point is praying the Shema, which of course sort of mentions the going out of Egypt, and we're going to see that a little bit more tomorrow. So, some have tried to make some hay out of the fact that the earlier text, the one from the Tosefta, is focusing on laws, whereas the one that we actually have in our Haggadah is focusing on telling the story, and may in that way be more accessible. I'm sort of noting that Rabban Gamliel is the main character in the older text, or the one in the Tosefta, and then we have pretty much everybody except for Rabban Gamliel in the text that we have, and may also indicate sort of the opening of the doors. If Rabban Gamliel is more symbolic of locking the doors of the Beit Midrash, which he's headed to with his Zikanim, with his elders, then in our version we have Rav Elazar ben Azariah, who is more symbolic of the open Beit Midrash and an opportunity for more people to tell the story, as coming in. I wanted to just end with one last text, which is the only other place that I could find in rabbinic literature in which the 5 rabbis that we have in our version in the Haggadah actually show up together. And it's a story of Rabbi Eliezer, the first rabbi of the 5 rabbis who's listed, when he becomes sick, and the other 4 rabbis in our story come to visit him and to pay him a sort of a get well visit. And we're going to explore this a little bit more tomorrow, but I'll just read it here. Rabbi Eliezer fell ill. Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Azar ben Azar, and Rabbi Akiva came to visit him. Rabbi Tarfon said, you're going to see a similarity between the first 3 comments. Master, you're more precious to Israel than the orb of the sun. For the orb of the sun sheds light on this world, while you have enlightened both this world and the world to come. That's Rabbi Tarfon's sort of attempt to make him feel better. Rabbi Yoshua said, Master, you're more precious to Israel than the gift of rain. For rain grants life in this world, while you give it in this world and the world to come. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, Master, you're more precious to Israel than one's father and mother. For father and mother bring one into this world, while you have brought us into this world and into the world to come. A lot of praise to Rabbi Eliezer for the sort of eternal value of his teachings, in contrast to the sun and the rain and to parents, which are obviously life-giving forces for everybody else. Rabbi Akiva says something else. He says, Rabbi Chavivim Yisurin, precious are sufferings. Your suffering is not in vain. There's some value to your suffering, which itself is a big rabbinic debate. Is suffering valuable or not? Rabbi Akiva has some experience with this coming toward the end of his life. But we're going to see this sort of contrast between this world and the world to come. That's played out in this story is also something that we're going to look at tomorrow when we look at the continued story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So I'm bringing this as just the other story, the other narrative of these 5 rabbis showing up together somewhere else in rabbinic literature. And we can try to figure out what significance we want to bring to that. And tomorrow we're going to jump in further to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and what he's telling us about the eternality or not of the story of Pesach.